Imagine standing in the heart of ancient Rome, where the streets buzz with merchants, soldiers, and whispers of politics that could topple empires. Among the countless figures who walk those cobblestones, one name would echo louder than all. Others Julius Caesar. He was not just a general, not just a politician, but a man whose ambition and vision reshaped the fate of Rome forever. His story is one of power, betrayal, and transformation, a story so monumental that we still feel its ripples today. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where we unravel the past in calm, steady detail perfect for listening as you relax or drift into rest. Before we set sail into Caesar's world, don't forget to gently press the like button and subscribe, so you can always return to these long journeys through history whenever you need them. Tonight, we'll explore how one man changed Rome forever. From his youth to his rise as a military genius, from his sweeping reforms to the drama of his downfall, we'll walk carefully through the streets of the Republic on the very edge of becoming an empire. So settle in, get comfortable, and let U.S. begin. The story of Julius Caesar begins not with the thunder of battle or the weight of political speeches, but with the quiet foundations of his youth. Before he was the general who marched across Gaul, before he was the statesman who redefined Rome, he was simply a boy born into a city that was already centuries old, layered with traditions, rivalries, and expectations. Rome, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, was no longer the modest republic of farmers and soldiers it had once been. It was a city swelling with wealth, ambition, and conflict. To be born into it was to be born into a contest, and Caesar was destined to play that contest at the highest stakes. Gaius Julius Caesar came into the world in 100 BCE. His family claimed descent from an ancient line, the Iuli, one of Rome's oldest patrician houses. Names carried weight in Rome, and his did more than most. The Iuli traced their ancestry back to the earliest days of the city, to figures who were woven into the fabric of its legends. This heritage gave Caesar a sense of belonging to Rome's deepest roots, yet in practical terms his family was not among the richest or most powerful at the time of his birth. They carried prestige, but not dominance. It was an interesting position, noble enough to expect respect, but not so secure as to be beyond the reach of hardship. For a young Caesar, this meant that ambition would not simply be a luxury. It would be a necessity. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, held a respectable role in Roman politics, serving as governor of a province. His mother, Aurelia, came from a prominent family as well, and was widely regarded as a woman of intelligence, discipline, and strong character. Many later historians credited her with shaping Caesar's early years more than anyone else. Aurelia was known for her sharp mind and practical strength, qualities that her son would inherit and refine. Growing up under her influence, young, Julius absorbed lessons not only in household management, but also in resilience and strategy. A Roman household was a small empire in itself, and Aurelia ran hers with the same firmness and order that Rome expected of its leaders. The Rome of Caesar's childhood was a bustling, unpredictable city. Its streets were crowded with vendors, patricians in fine togas, and ordinary citizens pushing through the forum to hear the latest political debates. The city smelled of olive oil, dust, and sweat. Its air was filled with the noise of construction, soldiers training, and arguments rising from taverns. To walk through it as a child was to be immersed in the contradictions of Roman life, immense wealth next to desperate poverty, high ideals of civic virtue next to the constant reality of corruption and violence. Caesar grew up in this environment, absorbing both the grandeur and the chaos. Education for a Roman boy of his standing was rigorous. From an early age, he was trained not only to read and write, but to master rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Words in Rome were weapons as sharp as swords. To speak well was to command respect. To fail at it was to be invisible. Caesar's teachers drilled him in the classics of Roman and Greek literature, shaping his taste for eloquence and history. He read the speeches of orators, the verses of poets, the accounts of military campaigns. He learned how to construct an argument, how to sway an audience, how to use silence as effectively as sound. Even in youth, he displayed a remarkable ability to remember details and to charm others with his confidence. But Caesar's education was not confined to books and speeches. He lived in a society where the threat of violence was never far away. Rivalries between powerful families often spilled into the streets. Political disputes could end in bloodshed. As he grew older, Caesar witnessed firsthand how fragile the republic could be and how quickly fortune could change. He learned early that survival in Rome required not just intelligence, but also adaptability. There were moments in his childhood that foreshadowed his later determination. He was known for his unwillingness to back down from challenges, even when it placed him at risk. He developed a sense of personal pride that could border on stubbornness, yet behind it was a clear calculation. In Rome, to appear weak was to invite defeat. Every decision was a performance, every gesture a signal to others about strength or vulnerability. Caesar absorbed this unspoken code and began to shape himself into someone who could not only endure Rome's demands but rise above them. One of the most striking features of his youth was his physical presence. He was not the most imposing boy, but he was athletic, disciplined, and resilient. He trained his body as carefully as his mind, understanding that a Roman leader was expected to embody both intellect and strength. He participated in exercises, learned the skills of riding and weapon handling, and embraced the ideal of the Roman citizen soldier. These habits would serve him well later in life, when long campaigns tested both his endurance and his charisma among troops. Soldiers respected commanders who shared their hardships, and Caesar would become famous for doing exactly that. Yet in his youth, his life was not without danger. As a teenager, he experienced firsthand how political tides could threaten even established families. During the power struggles that rocked Rome, Caesar found himself targeted because of his family connections. He was forced to navigate a dangerous landscape where alliances shifted rapidly and survival sometimes depended on luck as much as judgment. At one point, he had to go into hiding, moving quietly to avoid capture by rival factions. These early brushes with danger hardened him, teaching him that Rome's politics were not a game but a battlefield. Despite these challenges, Caesar's ambition only deepened. He understood that his path would not be simple, but he also believed that his destiny was greater than the obstacles before him. His education, his family name, his early experiences with both privilege and danger, all of these combined to form a young man who was unusually focused and unusually determined. As he moved from adolescence into early adulthood, Caesar began to step into the public eye. He was careful, deliberate, and aware that every move would be judged by peers and rivals alike. His speeches were crafted to win allies, his manner designed to project confidence. He wore his toga with care, carried himself with poise, and cultivated friendships that would later prove useful. Even then, there was something magnetic about him, an energy that drew others in, whether they loved him or feared him. But beneath the charm and polish, Caesar never forgot the lessons of his youth. He had seen instability, he had felt danger, and he had watched how quickly Rome could turn on its own. He knew that if he wanted to secure not only survival but greatness, he would need to play the game more skillfully than anyone else. He would need to understand people, to manipulate circumstances, to seize opportunities that others hesitated to grasp. Most of all, he would need to believe in himself with a conviction so unshakable that it could withstand betrayal, setbacks, and the weight of Rome's traditions. This was the foundation of Julius Caesar, a boy molded by a proud family, sharpened by the streets of a turbulent city, and driven by an ambition that never rested. By the time he reached adulthood, the course of his life was already tilting toward the extraordinary. The world of Rome was changing, and Caesar was preparing to change with it, not just to survive, but to dominate. And so, as the young Julius, Caesar stepped into the public sphere. The stage was quietly set for a career that would defy expectations, challenge the Republic, and leave a legacy that no one in Rome could have imagined at his birth. The young Julius Caesar, having grown into adulthood with the confidence of his patrician name and the resilience forged in a turbulent city, began to take his first deliberate steps onto the stage of Roman public life. Rome was not a place where one could simply drift into prominence. Every move was observed, judged, and contested. For Caesar, those early years were a balancing act between opportunity and danger, as he sought to prove himself worthy of leadership without becoming a casualty of the fierce rivalries that ruled the Republic. Caesar entered adulthood in a city that seemed to breathe ambition. Political factions competed constantly, and alliances shifted with dizzying speed. To navigate Rome's public life required sharp judgment, quick adaptability, and an instinct for knowing when to risk everything and when to retreat. The Republic was officially governed by laws, magistracies, and assemblies, but beneath the surface, power often belonged to those who could inspire loyalty, command wealth, or intimidate rivals. Caesar, though still young, understood that this was not a system in which tradition alone could guarantee success. Action was necessary, boldness rewarded, and hesitation punished. His earliest years as a man of standing were marked by trials that would have broken someone less determined. A political shift placed him in jeopardy when the dictator Sulla rose to dominance. Sulla, a seasoned general, sought to eliminate anyone connected to his opponents. Caesar's family, through marriage ties, was linked to Sulla's rivals. This association was enough to bring danger upon the young Julius. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce his wife Cornelia, the daughter of a powerful man who stood against him. For Caesar, this was not a simple demand, it was a test of loyalty and a threat to his identity. To yield would mean compromising his honor and submitting to the will of another. To resist meant risking everything. Caesar chose resistance. He refused to abandon Cornelia, even though Sulla's demand came with an unmistakable threat. His refusal forced him into hiding, slipping through the back streets of Rome and into the countryside. Soldiers were sent after him, and at one point he was captured, only escaping through bribes and the quiet intercession of friends who still held influence. It was a dangerous, uncertain time, and for a while it seemed as if his life might be cut short before it truly began. Yet this crisis, far from breaking him, reinforced the iron in his character. Later accounts describe Sulla remarking, perhaps with reluctant admiration, that within this young man were Marius's many future threats to the established order. Even his enemies recognized in Caesar a force that could not be easily subdued. Exile, however temporary, left its mark. Deprived of the comfort of home and the security of family networks, Caesar experienced firsthand the fragility of status in Rome. It was not enough to be born into an old name. Fortune could turn swiftly, and even the proudest heritage could not shield one from the whims of power. This lesson sank deep into his mind. From then on, Caesar sought not only survival, but mastery of the very system that had nearly destroyed him. He would not simply live within Rome's political order. He would learn how to bend it to his will. When the storm of Sulla's dictatorship subsided and Caesar was able to return, he did so with a sharpened sense of purpose. He began to build his career with careful attention to reputation. His first notable steps were not in politics, but in the military. He served with distinction in Asia Minor, gaining experience in the field that would later become central to his identity. One incident during this period revealed his audacity in unforgettable fashion. While traveling across the Aegean Sea, Caesar was captured by pirates. The pirates, regarding him as an aristocratic Roman worth ransom, held him for a considerable sum. Most captives would have been humiliated, frightened, and eager to appease their captors. Caesar, however, behaved in a manner so unexpected that it left even his enemies bewildered. He treated the pirates not as masters, but as subordinates. He joked with them, ordered them to remain silent when he wished to sleep, and participated in their games with a casual authority, as if he were the leader of the group rather than their prisoner. At one point, he told them half in jest, half in promise, that once he was freed, he would return to hunt them down and execute them. The pirates laughed, assuming his words were the bravado of a captive. But when Caesar's ransom was paid, and he was released, he immediately organized a force, tracked the pirates to their camp, captured them, and carried out his promise. This episode spread widely, and the young Caesar gained a reputation not only for daring, but for determination that could not be dismissed. His military service added another layer to his emerging character. He proved himself capable in command, quick to adapt, and fearless in action. He was not yet the legendary general who would lead vast armies across Gaul, but the seeds of that commander were already visible. More importantly, his experiences confirmed for him that military achievement was the surest path to both honor and influence in Rome. Politicians might rise and fall with speeches and alliances, but a general with loyal soldiers could shape the fate of the Republic itself. By the time he returned to Rome, Caesar's reputation was no longer confined to his family name. He was beginning to be seen as a figure of substance in his own right, a man marked by courage, wit, and the ability to turn adversity into triumph. He pursued legal cases in the courts, where his skill in oratory shone. He spoke with clarity and passion, often choosing to prosecute those who were unpopular, thus earning both attention and favor from the public. The crowds in the forum listened closely, not only because his words were clever, but because his delivery carried the weight of confidence. Even as a relatively young advocate, he seemed to understand instinctively how to hold an audience. What distinguished Caesar in these early years was not simply talent, but strategy. He sought out positions that would broaden his network and heighten his visibility. He aligned himself with popular causes, winning the goodwill of the people, while carefully building connections among those with influence. He spent generously, sometimes more than his means allowed, to host games and entertainments that made him beloved by the masses. Though this left him in debt, he considered it an investment in his future. Popularity could be as powerful as wealth, and Caesar was determined to cultivate it. Debt became one of the defining challenges of his early career. To finance his ambitions, he borrowed heavily, relying on the support of powerful patrons. This was a dangerous path, for failure to rise would leave him ruined. Yet Caesar was willing to gamble, certain that his skills and charisma would repay the risk. For him, debt was not a chain, but a weapon, an instrument to propel him forward at a speed that careful caution could never achieve. This boldness, this willingness to stake everything on his future, would become a hallmark of his life as he advanced through the lower offices of the Roman political ladder. Caesar demonstrated the same combination of charm and resolve. He was elected to roles that gave him increasing visibility, each step a rung on the ladder toward higher office. He worked tirelessly to win allies, using both personal charisma and calculated generosity. His home became a gathering place, his presence in the forum a magnet for attention. He began to embody the ideal of the rising Roman statesman, accessible to the people, formidable to rivals, and ambitious without apology. It is important to understand that Rome at this time was not a stable society. The Republic was stretched thin by its growing territories, its politics dominated by the tension between powerful aristocrats and leaders who claimed to represent the people. Violence was a frequent tool of persuasion, and corruption was widespread. In this volatile environment, Caesar's combination of daring, intelligence, and calculated generosity allowed him to stand out. He was not the only ambitious young man in Rome, but he was one of the few who seemed capable of harnessing both the loyalty of the masses and the respect of influential figures. By the time Caesar reached his 30s, he had already survived political persecution, escaped pirates, distinguished himself in military service, and won recognition in the courts. His debts were heavy, but so too was the weight of expectation. Many in Rome now saw him as a rising star, though opinions varied. To some, he was a dangerous opportunist, to others a promising leader, but no one dismissed him. The boy who had once hidden from Sulla's soldiers was now a man whose name carried both admiration and suspicion. The years ahead would only intensify these qualities. Caesar was on the threshold of greater power, his ambition pressing him onward. Rome itself was moving toward a crisis, its institutions strained, its rivalries sharpening. Caesar did not create these conditions. but he would seize upon them with unmatched skill. The young man who had risked everything rather than abandon his wife, who had laughed in the face of pirates, who had spent lavishly to win the crowd, this was a man preparing to climb higher still, into the heart of Roman politics and onto the stage of history. The first steps of his career revealed not only his resilience but his method: to dare, where others hesitated, to invest in reputation as much as in resources, and to turn every setback into a story of triumph. This method would carry him far, but it would also place him on a collision course with the very structures of the Republic. Julius Caesar's early career had already set him apart from his peers. He had shown himself as a man willing to risk, a man who could charm the people, and a man who would not bend to pressure, even when powerful figures demanded submission. But if ambition was to carry him higher, he would need something more than personal daring and courtroom brilliance. In Rome, true authority was often built on military glory. The Republic revered generals who brought victory, wealth, and new lands into its grasp. It was soldiers, not merely senators, who could command the loyalty of Rome's masses and force the respect of rivals. Caesar understood this deeply, and so his next steps would intertwine the path of soldier and statesman in a way that would forever shape his destiny. Caesar's opportunities began with posts that took him away from Rome itself. These assignments were not glamorous at first, but they offered something valuable: experience. He served in Spain as quaestor, a financial official, and it was here that he first showed the energy and vision that would become his trademarks. Unlike many Roman officials who treated such postings as a chance to enrich themselves quietly and return home with wealth, Caesar treated his time abroad as a stage to prove his abilities. He managed finances with skill, but more importantly, he observed the soldiers, the provinces, and the vast machinery of Roman power in action. He watched how governors ruled, how armies were supplied, how discipline was maintained, and how distant peoples responded to the authority of Rome. Even at this relatively early point in his career, Caesar carried himself with the presence of a leader. He lived among soldiers, shared their hardships, and impressed them with his vigor. He was not yet commanding vast legions, but he was laying the groundwork for something greater: the creation of loyalty through shared experience. Roman soldiers respected not only bravery in battle, but also leaders who did not hold themselves apart. Caesar instinctively grasped this and began cultivating a reputation that would one day make men march across continents for him. His time in Spain also sharpened his awareness of opportunity. He saw firsthand the wealth and resources that lay outside Italy, resources that generals could use to finance ambitions at home. Rome was no longer simply a city-state governing its neighbors. It was an empire in all but name, stretching across the Mediterranean. Those who governed its provinces wielded enormous influence, and Caesar began to understand that to truly rise, he must not only excel in Rome, but also prove himself abroad. Yet even as he gained experience in Spain, Caesar did not neglect his political career. Returning to Rome, he continued his climb through the ranks, securing the office of aedile. This position placed him in charge of public works and games, and Caesar seized the chance to dazzle the people. He staged grand spectacles, spending far beyond his means to entertain the masses with festivals and gladiatorial contests. His debts grew enormous, but so too did his popularity. Crowds thronged to his events, cheering his generosity, while rivals muttered that no man could continue at such a pace without ruin. But Caesar understood the calculus. Reputation was worth more than coin. With every spectacle he bought not only applause but loyalty, planting seeds that would bear fruit when he needed the support of the populace. It was around this time that Caesar's connections began to place him at the center of Roman politics. He aligned himself with figures who commanded vast influence, among them Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, better known as Pompey the Great. Pompey was a celebrated general, a man whose victories had extended Rome's dominion, and who was adored by his troops. Aligning with Pompey gave Caesar access to networks of power that would have been otherwise beyond his reach. Yet Caesar was not content to be merely a supporter. He maneuvered with care, offering his charm and skill to eyes while always keeping his own ambitions in sight. A particularly bold step came when Caesar supported the restoration of tribunes who had been stripped of power. The tribunes represented the voice of the people, and their cause was popular among the masses, but opposed by much of the Senate. By backing them, Caesar signaled his willingness to stand with the people against entrenched aristocratic interests. This made him beloved by many and distrusted by others, but it ensured that he was no longer just another office holder. He was now seen as a champion of the common citizen. His debts, however, remained a pressing concern. Without the resources to sustain his career, Caesar risked collapse. It was at this crucial juncture that he secured the backing of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome. Crassus had built his fortune through property, business, and shrewd exploitation of opportunities, and he sought influence to match his wealth. Caesar, brilliant but indebted, and Crassus, rich but often overshadowed by others, made an effective partnership. Crassus's gold supported Caesar's ambitions, while Caesar's rising popularity offered Crassus a channel to greater political leverage. This alliance would prove instrumental in the years ahead. Caesar's career took another leap when he was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief religious official of Rome. The office carried enormous prestige, granting him a permanent residence in the Forum and a visible presence at the heart of public life. Although his election shocked many, he was young for the position and won through lavish spending and political maneuvering. It solidified his role as one of Rome's most prominent figures. From this point on, Caesar was no longer merely an ambitious young noble. He was a central figure in the life of the Republic. His ambitions next carried him back to Spain, this time as governor. Here, Caesar had the chance to command directly, and he seized it. He led campaigns against rebellious tribes, proving himself a capable military commander. His victories, though not on the scale of the great wars fought by Pompey, brought him honor, wealth to pay down debts, and above all the loyalty of soldiers who had fought under his leadership. His time in Spain demonstrated the qualities that would later define his generalship: decisiveness, the ability to inspire troops, and the boldness to take risks that others might avoid. Soldiers followed him not only because he commanded, but because he led by example, sharing their dangers and hardships. It was during this governorship that Caesar is said to have encountered a statue of Alexander the Great. Seeing the image of the Macedonian conqueror, who by his age had subdued vast territories, Caesar reportedly felt a pang of shame that he had accomplished so little by comparison. Whether the story is legend or fact, it reflects a truth about Caesar's ambition. He did not measure himself against ordinary men, but against giants of history. For him, Rome was not simply a career. It was a stage upon which he intended to leave a mark as indelible as Alexander's. Returning from Spain, Caesar entered a Rome bristling with political conflict. Pompey, though powerful, faced resistance from the Senate, which was reluctant to grant him the recognition and authority he sought. Crassus, despite his wealth, remained politically isolated. Caesar saw an opportunity. He positioned himself as the bridge between these two men, forging an alliance that would dominate Rome, the first triumvirate. This informal pact bound Caesar, Pompey and Crassus together, each offering the others what they lacked. Pompey brought military prestige, Crassus supplied immense wealth, and Caesar contributed popularity and political skill. The triumvirate was not announced publicly as a covenant government, but functioned as one in practice. Together they advanced their agendas, overwhelming opposition and consolidating control. For Caesar, this alliance was a masterstroke. It provided him the backing to secure one of the most powerful posts in Rome, the governorship of Gaul. It is here that the trajectory of Caesar's life entered its decisive phase. With Gaul as his command, he would embark on a series of campaigns that not only expanded Rome's territory but also transformed him from an ambitious statesman into a figure of near mythic stature. His time in Gaul would be marked by relentless energy, strategic brilliance, and the accumulation of personal power that would eventually set him on a collision course with the Republic itself. But before the thunder of conquest began, Caesar had already demonstrated the qualities that would define his rise: the willingness to risk ruin for reputation, the ability to charm and win allies, the instinct to turn setbacks into triumphs, and above all, the relentless drive to climb higher. In his early military commands, his dazzling games, his political alliances, and his deft balancing of debt and ambition, Caesar had shown that he was no ordinary Roman. He was a man preparing to reach for greatness, and Rome was beginning to realize it. As the governor of Gaul, Caesar would soon step onto a stage far larger than any before. The man who had once been a fugitive, who had laughed in the face of pirates, who had dazzled crowds with spectacles, was about to command armies across an entire region. The Republic, already fragile, would never be the same. When Julius Caesar assumed command in Gaul, he did not yet carry the aura of destiny that would later surround his name. He was ambitious, clever, and already admired in Rome, but he was not yet the master of vast armies or the figure who would stand against the Senate itself. Gaul, however, would change everything. In the span of less than a decade, Caesar transformed his command into one of the most extraordinary military campaigns of antiquity, carving out victories that expanded Rome's borders and securing a personal following that no rival in the Republic could match. Gaul was a vast and restless region, home to dozens of tribes, each with its own leaders, customs, and rivalries. For generations, Rome had maintained influence in parts of the area, especially in the south, where the province of Gallia Narbonensis connected Italy to Spain. But the lands beyond were only loosely tied to Roman authority. To Rome's elite, the governorship of Gaul might have seemed like a difficult but not extraordinary assignment. To Caesar, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He saw in the region not only the chance to defend Roman interests, but the stage upon which he could craft a legacy of conquest that would rival any general before him. From the beginning, Caesar moved with the decisiveness that characterized his leadership. He understood that the tribes of Gaul were divided, often at odds with one another, and he turned this reality to his advantage. Rather than treating Gaul as a monolithic enemy, he approached it as a complex web of rival powers that could be manipulated, played against each other, and conquered in stages. Where diplomacy could secure advantage, he used it. Where force was required, he delivered it swiftly and with overwhelming impact. This blend of political cunning and military ferocity became the hallmark of his Gallic campaigns, one of his earliest. Challenges came with the Helvetii, a powerful tribal confederation that sought to migrate westward through Roman territory. Their movement threatened to destabilize the balance of the region and alarmed Rome, which feared the consequences of such a mass migration. Caesar acted quickly, mobilizing his legions to block their advance. The Helvetii were formidable, but Caesar's discipline and organization prevailed. After hard fighting, the Helvetii were defeated and forced to return to their homeland. This victory, though only the beginning, sent a message across Gaul. Rome under Caesar was a force to be reckoned with, but the Helvetii were only a prelude. Soon after, Caesar turned his attention to a far greater threat, the Germanic leader, Ariovistus, who had crossed the Rhine and sought to dominate Gaul. Ariovistus commanded fearsome warriors, and his presence threatened both Roman allies and Caesar's own authority. In a decisive battle, Caesar confronted him. His soldiers, though initially anxious about facing an enemy with such a fearsome reputation, were rallied by Caesar's unshakable confidence. He reminded them of their training, their discipline, and the honor of Rome. When the fighting came, the Roman legions, drilled to perfection, broke Ariovistus's forces and drove them back across the Rhine. It was a victory not only of arms but of morale, proving that Caesar could lead his men against even the most daunting opponents. Over the following years, Caesar extended his campaigns. Deeper into Gaul, he fought against tribes such as the Belgae in the north and the Nervi, who nearly destroyed his army in a sudden ambush. That battle, among the most dangerous moments of his career, revealed both the vulnerability and the resilience of his command. Taken by surprise and pressed hard, Caesar personally entered the fray, rallying his men with direct leadership. His presence on the battlefield was not distant or detached. He fought alongside his soldiers, showing them that their commander shared their risks. The legions, inspired by his courage, turned the tide and achieved victory. In the aftermath, Caesar praised their bravery in his commentaries, ensuring that their deeds and his leadership were recorded for both Rome and history. Caesar's campaigns were not only a matter of brute force. He demonstrated remarkable logistical skill, moving his armies swiftly across difficult terrain, building bridges, and constructing fortifications that allowed him to outmaneuver enemies. His famous bridge across the Rhine, built in an astonishingly short time, was not simply a practical feat, but a statement of power. By crossing into Germanic territory and then withdrawing after making his point, Caesar showed that Rome could go anywhere, do anything, and strike at will. It was psychological warfare as much as military engineering, and it cemented his reputation for audacity. One of the most striking aspects of the Gallic campaigns was Caesar's relationship with his soldiers. He did not command from afar, but lived among them, shared their hardships, and made himself accessible. He knew their names, listened to their concerns, and rewarded their loyalty. In return, they gave him devotion that went beyond ordinary duty. They were not simply fighting for Rome, they were fighting for Caesar. This bond was one of the most important outcomes of the Gallic Wars, for it created a personal army whose allegiance was to their general as much as to the Republic. Of course, conquest in Gaul was not uncontested. The tribes resisted fiercely, and Caesar faced rebellions and coalitions determined to resist Roman domination. The most formidable of these came under the leadership of Vercingetorix, a charismatic chieftain who managed to unite many of the Gallic tribes in common cause. For the first time, Caesar faced not scattered enemies, but a coordinated resistance with the potential to drive Rome out of Gaul. The struggle against Vercingetorix culminated in the famous siege of Alesia. There, Caesar demonstrated the full extent of his strategic genius. The Gallic forces, numerous and determined, occupied a fortified stronghold. Rather than launching reckless assaults, Caesar encircled the city with an extraordinary feat of engineering, a double line of fortifications, one facing inward to contain the defenders, and another facing outward to repel any relief forces. For weeks, the Romans held their ground against desperate attacks from both within and without. Hunger gnawed at the besieged, and fierce battles raged along the Roman lines. Yet Caesar's discipline held, and in the end, Vercingetorix was forced to surrender. The victory at Alesia was decisive. Though resistance would flare up again, the power of Gaul was broken. Rome emerged as the undisputed master of the region, and Caesar as the man who had achieved what no one before him had accomplished. In less than a decade, he had conquered a vast territory, subdued countless tribes, and extended Rome's reach. To the Atlantic, the triumph was not merely military. It reshaped the political landscape of the Republic. Caesar returned from Gaul not just as a successful governor, but as the commander of hardened legions utterly loyal to him, and as a figure whose fame eclipsed that of nearly every rival in Rome. Throughout the campaigns, Caesar also cultivated his reputation through his own writings. His commentaries on the Gallic War, though presented as straightforward accounts, were carefully crafted narratives that highlighted his skill, justified his actions, and presented his victories as both necessary and glorious. These works circulated widely in Rome, read by citizens eager for news and by politicians measuring the rise of a man who seemed destined for greatness. By shaping his own story, Caesar ensured that his deeds would not be left to the interpretation of others. The conquest of Gaul left Caesar with immense wealth, much of it seized from defeated tribes. This fortune allowed him to pay his debts, reward his soldiers, and finance further ambitions. Yet it also left him with something more dangerous: the envy and fear of rivals in Rome. Men such as Pompey and members of the Senate saw clearly that Caesar's power was no longer contained by ordinary offices. He had become a force in his own right, and many wondered whether he would use that force to dominate the Republic itself. For Caesar, however, the path was clear. He had not endured exile, risked ruin, fought pirates, and conquered Gaul merely to fade into the background. Every step of his career had been a climb, and now he stood higher than ever before. His soldiers adored him, his name was celebrated across Rome, and his enemies whispered in fear of what he might do next. The conquest of Gaul was not the end of his story, but the turning point that propelled him from ambitious statesman to a man whose power rivaled that of the Republic itself. As he prepared to return to Rome, the question was no longer whether Caesar would shape the future, but how and at what cost. By the time Julius Caesar emerged victorious from Gaul, he was no longer just another Roman general. He was a figure of immense renown, his name spoken with admiration by common citizens and with dread by many senators. His campaigns had not only secured vast new territories for Rome, but had given him something even more powerful, an army that was devoted to him personally, loyal not just to the Republic, but to Caesar himself. The bond between general and soldier forged through years of shared hardship and triumphant victories had grown so strong that it overshadowed the authority of Rome's political institutions. This reality set the stage for a confrontation that had been building for years, a confrontation that would ultimately tear apart the Republic. When Caesar returned from Gaul, he was greeted as a hero by the Roman populace. His victories were celebrated, his triumphs the talk of the city. Yet beneath the cheers of the people lay a deep unease among the Senate. The Republic had long prided itself on checks and balances, on preventing any single man from gaining absolute control. Caesar's rise threatened that system. His wealth, popularity, and military strength made him unlike any statesman before him. Even Pompey, once regarded as the greatest general of his generation, now found his fame overshadowed by his former ally. The triumvirate, the alliance of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, had once balanced these ambitions, but that balance was shattered. Crassus, whose wealth had fueled their partnership, had perished in the disastrous campaign against the Parthians. His death removed the one man who had kept Pompey and Caesar in uneasy cooperation. With Crassus gone, the Republic was left with two titans whose ambitions could no longer coexist peacefully. Pompey had drifted closer to the Senate, aligning himself with conservatives who feared Caesar's growing influence. These senators, known for their defense of traditional privileges, saw in Pompey a counterweight to Caesar's power. They flattered him, granted him authority, and urged him to act as the protector of the Republic against the rising threat of dictatorship. Pompey, though once Caesar's ally and even his son-in-law through marriage to Julia, began to view his former partner with suspicion. Julia's death and childbirth had already weakened their bond, and without her, the personal tie that once held them together was gone. Caesar, for his part, was not blind to the shifting winds. He knew that his enemies in the Senate sought to strip him of his command the moment he returned to Rome. Without the protection of his legions, he would be vulnerable to prosecution, accused of exceeding his authority in Gaul or of misusing his power for personal gain. Trials in Rome were not always about justice. They were political weapons, and Caesar knew that if he entered the city as a private citizen, stripped of his imperium, his career and perhaps his life could be destroyed. Thus began the standoff. The Senate, encouraged by Pompey, demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome. Caesar responded with offers of compromise. He proposed that both he and Pompey relinquish their commands simultaneously, ensuring neither held unfair advantage. But his enemies rejected this. They wanted Caesar weakened, disarmed, and at their mercy. For Caesar, compromise had always been a tool, but surrender was unthinkable. The tension grew unbearable. In Rome, politicians gave fiery speeches warning of tyranny, while Caesar's supporters defended him as a man of the people unfairly targeted by jealous rivals. The city became a cauldron of rumor and fear. Outside its walls, Caesar weighed his options. He was stationed in Cisalpine Gaul, north of Italy, with his legions camped at the river Rubicon. The Senate had issued a direct order: Caesar must disband his army and return alone. To obey would mean humiliation and likely destruction. To defy would mean civil war. It was a moment that tested not only Caesar's ambition, but his resolve. He knew that crossing into Italy with his army would break Roman law, which forbade generals from bringing legions across the Rubicon to do so as to declare war on the Senate and on Pompey himself. Yet to hesitate was to surrender everything he had built. On a winter night in 49 BCE, Caesar made his choice. Standing before his soldiers at the Rubicon, he spoke words that would echo through history. Alia iacta est, the die is cast. With that, he led his legions across the river, marching south into Italy. The Republic would never be the same. The reaction was immediate. Panic spread through Rome as news arrived that Caesar's veterans, hardened by years in Gaul, were advancing toward the capital. Pompey and the Senate, unprepared for the speed of his move, fled the city. They retreated to the south, gathering forces in hopes of mounting resistance. Caesar entered Rome not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a man who claimed necessity. He declared that he sought only to protect his dignitas, his honor, and to defend himself against unjust persecution. But behind his words lay the unmistakable truth. He now held Rome in his grasp. The March on Rome revealed much about Caesar's style of leadership. He did not descend into reckless bloodshed. Instead, he offered clemency to those who yielded, presenting himself as a man of mercy rather than vengeance. This approach won him support from wavering allies and softened the image of rebellion. Yet mercy was paired with firmness. Those who resisted him found that his legions were not to be underestimated. Towns and cities opened their gates, unwilling to risk destruction. In a matter of weeks, Caesar had secured Italy with astonishing speed. But the conflict was far from over. Pompey still commanded significant forces and controlled the seas, giving him the ability to regroup in Greece. The Senate, rallying around him, declared Caesar an enemy of the state. What had begun as a political struggle had now become a civil war that would decide the fate of the Republic. As Caesar marched, he reflected on the choices that had brought him here. Every step, from his refusal to abandon Cornelia in his youth, to his defiance of the pirates, to his conquests in Gaul, had been a refusal to bow, a determination to carve his own destiny. Now that destiny demanded a greater gamble than any before. To retreat was to lose everything. To advance was to risk everything. Caesar, true to his nature, chose the path of boldness. The Republic had always prided itself on resisting kings and tyrants. Yet it had produced a man whose power rivaled all of its traditions. The senators who fled Rome believed they were defending liberty. Caesar believed he was defending his honor. The soldiers who followed him believed they were defending their general. The people of Rome, exhausted by years of corruption and inequality, believed perhaps that Caesar might bring stability. All of these forces collided in a storm that would sweep across the Mediterranean dot as he stood in the Forum, preparing for the battles that lay ahead. Caesar could not have missed the irony. The republic he claimed to defend was already breaking beneath the weight of ambition and rivalry. He had not created the crisis, but he had seized it. And now, with legions at his back and Rome at his feet, he would march into history not as a mere general, but as the man who dared to challenge the republic itself. The moment Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the republic itself was set on a course it could not reverse. What followed was not merely a clash of armies, but a struggle for the soul of Rome, a test of loyalty, discipline, and ambition that would stretch across continents. Caesar, marching south into Italy with his veterans, knew that he was risking everything he had built. But he also knew that fortune favored boldness, and in the first moves of the Civil War, he showed the same speed, calculation, and daring that had carried him from obscurity to prominence. Italy fell to Caesar almost without resistance. Pompey and the Senate had not expected him to move so swiftly. At the mere rumor of his advance, panic spread. Senators and magistrates abandoned the city, fleeing to Pompey's side in the south. Their hope was to regroup, use the fleets at Pompey's command to control the seas, and raise fresh armies in Greece and the eastern provinces. Caesar, meanwhile, demonstrated remarkable restraint. Rather than unleashing terror upon Rome, he presented himself as a liberator, offering clemency to those who submitted. Cities opened their gates to him. Soldiers who had served Pompey often chose instead to join the veterans of Gaul, swayed by Caesar's reputation and his promise of leniency. Within weeks, Caesar entered Rome as master of Italy, an astonishing achievement with almost no bloodshed. But the war was only beginning. Pompey's strength lay not in Italy, but in his control of the seas and the loyalty of Rome's provinces. In the east, his legions, though not yet assembled in full, would outnumber Caesar's if given time to organize. Caesar knew this. He also knew that his position in Rome was precarious. He had won the city, but victory would mean nothing if Pompey returned with overwhelming force. Speed was essential. He had to strike before Pompey could consolidate. Caesar's first target was Spain, where Pompey's legates commanded powerful armies. He marched his forces across the Alps and into the Iberian Peninsula, moving with the relentless pace that had become his trademark. His enemies expected delay, but Caesar's genius lay in his refusal to give them time. Confronting Pompey's commanders, he fought a series of engagements that demonstrated his adaptability. The campaign was grueling, fought across difficult terrain and under constant strain. Yet Caesar pressed forward. Eventually he surrounded his opponents at Ilerda. Through both combat and negotiation, he forced their surrender, capturing thousands of soldiers who might otherwise have swelled Pompey's ranks. By securing Spain, Caesar removed one of Pompey's strongest bases of support, and he did it in months rather than years. Returning to Rome, Caesar found himself hailed once more by the people, yet his mind was already on the next stage. Pompey was in Greece, gathering legions and supplies. To confront him, Caesar needed ships. Here, for the first time, his lack of naval strength proved a serious disadvantage. Pompey's control of the seas meant that Caesar could not simply ferry his entire army across the Adriatic at once. Instead, he made a daring gamble, transporting part of his force under cover of night. The crossing was dangerous, and his soldiers knew they were outnumbered. Yet Caesar's confidence carried them forward. He landed in Greece with only a portion of his legions, cut off from reinforcements and at risk of destruction if Pompey acted swiftly. It was a perilous situation, but Caesar thrived in such moments. He fortified his position, moved with speed, and used his veterans to hold their ground against larger forces. Eventually, additional legions managed to cross, despite Pompey's naval patrols. With his army united, Caesar prepared for the great showdown. The decisive confrontation came at Pharsalus in 48 BCE. The battlefield stretched across the plains of Thessaly, where Pompey commanded a force larger and better supplied than Caesar's. Senators who had fled Rome stood at his side, confident that this day would end Caesar's ambitions forever. Pompey's plan was cautious, designed to use his cavalry to envelop Caesar's smaller force. Caesar, however, anticipated this. He placed hidden reserves to counter Pompey's horsemen and instructed his men with precision. When the battle was joined, Caesar's veterans held firm against the larger enemy. At the critical moment, his concealed reserves struck, breaking Pompey's cavalry and turning the tide. Panic spread through Pompey's ranks, and Caesar's legions pressed forward with relentless discipline. By the day's end, Pompey's army was shattered. Pompey himself fled the field, his confidence broken. Caesar, victorious, showed clemency once more. He spared many of the senators and officers captured after the battle, believing mercy would strengthen his position. Yet this mercy also revealed something deeper. Caesar understood that his true conquest was not of armies, but of Rome itself. To rule, he needed not only soldiers, but legitimacy, and sparing his enemies served that purpose. Pompey, meanwhile, sought refuge in Egypt, hoping to find support from the young king Ptolemy XIII. But fortune had turned against him. Instead of sanctuary, he found betrayal. Ptolemy's advisors, eager to please Caesar, had Pompey assassinated upon his arrival. When Caesar reached Egypt soon after, he was presented with Pompey's severed head. The sight reportedly moved him to tears. Though rivals, Pompey had been a great man, and Caesar recognized that his death marked not only the end of their struggle, but the loss of a figure who had once stood as Rome's brightest star. Caesar's time in Egypt brought further trials. Drawn into the dynastic conflict between Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra, he found himself entangled in the politics of the Nile. Though his primary goal had been the pursuit of Pompey, Caesar adapted quickly, supporting Cleopatra in her bid for power. The details of their relationship have been endlessly debated, but what is clear is that Caesar's presence in Egypt reshaped its politics. He fought battles in Alexandria, enduring sieges and fire, before finally securing victory and placing Cleopatra on the throne. This episode revealed yet again his adaptability, his ability to turn unexpected events to his advantage. But the civil war was not yet finished. Across the provinces, resistance to Caesar remained. Senators who had fled after Pharsalus rallied. Forces in Africa. Others continued to raise armies in the east. Caesar, tireless, pursued them relentlessly. At Zela, he faced King Pharnacus, son of Mithridates of Pontus. The battle was swift, and Caesar's victory so decisive that he famously summarized it with 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. In those words he captured not only the speed of that campaign, but the essence of his style. Decisive, bold, and utterly confident. From there, Caesar marched into Africa, confronting the remnants of Pompey's supporters at Thapsus. Once again, his discipline and experience overcame the resistance. Many of his enemies fell, others fled, and Rome's opposition was shattered. Yet even then, the war dragged on. The sons of Pompey raised new forces in Spain, determined to avenge their father. Caesar, though weary, marched yet again. At Munda in 45 BCE, he fought one of the bloodiest battles of his career. His legions, hardened by years of war, met Pompeian forces in desperate combat. The fighting was savage, the outcome uncertain, but in the end Caesar triumphed. With that victory, the civil war was effectively over. The cost had been immense. Rome had been torn apart, its cities divided, its citizens forced to choose sides. Brothers had fought brothers, senators had fought soldiers, and the Republic itself had nearly destroyed itself under the weight of rivalry. Yet out of this chaos, Caesar emerged supreme. No rival remained who could challenge his authority. He had crossed the Rubicon as a rebel, fought across Spain, Greece, Egypt, Asia, and Africa, and returned as the master of the Roman world. The Civil War revealed not only Caesar's military genius, but his unyielding determination. Time and again, he faced situations that seemed hopeless, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, cut off. Time and again, he turned those situations into victories through speed, discipline, and sheer will. His soldiers followed him, not because they were forced, but because they believed in him. They had marched with him through snow and heat, through hunger and danger, and he had never abandoned them. In return, they gave him loyalty that no Senate decree could break. But victory in war brought new challenges. The Republic, already fragile, was now in pieces. Caesar's triumph made him the single most powerful man in Rome, but it also raised the question that had haunted the Republic for generations. Could one man hold so much power without destroying the very fabric of Roman liberty? For now Caesar stood at the height of his strength. The Civil War was won, his enemies scattered, and his name spoken with awe. Yet beneath the triumph lay the shadows of suspicion and fear, shadows that would follow him until the final day of his life. When the dust of civil war settled, Julius Caesar returned to Rome not as a mere general but as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The long years of conflict had broken his rivals one by one: Pompey, at Pharsalus, the Pompeian legates. In Africa, the remnants of resistance in Spain. What remained was a republic deeply scarred, its institutions weakened, its people exhausted. The Senate still met, magistrates still wore their insignia, and the assemblies still gathered. But everyone knew that power now lay in the hands of a single man. For the first time in centuries, Rome looked not to a collective body of senators for leadership, but to an individual, and that individual was Julius Caesar. His return was accompanied by triumphs that celebrated his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, Africa, and Spain. The city had not seen such grandeur in living memory. Soldiers marched through the streets, laden with spoils. Prisoners of war, chiefs from distant tribes, and exotic animals were displayed before cheering crowds. But while triumphs were displays of military success, Caesar understood that he could not rely on pageantry alone. Rome was weary of war. Its citizens longed for stability, prosperity, and relief from the constant turmoil of the last decades. To secure his position, Caesar would have to provide more than victories. He would have to govern. Caesar set about reshaping Rome with characteristic energy. He introduced reforms that touched nearly every aspect of Roman life, from government to society to the calendar itself. Some were practical measures to address pressing issues. Others were bold strokes that revealed his vision for a new kind of Rome. Taken together, they represented an attempt to transform the Republic into something more efficient, more centralized, and inevitably more centered on himself. One of his first priorities was debt. Years of civil war had thrown Rome's economy into disorder, and many citizens faced crushing obligations. Caesar enacted laws to ease this burden, reducing interest rates and providing relief to debtors. He did not cancel debts outright, a move that would have enraged creditors, but he struck a balance that offered hope to the struggling while preserving confidence among the wealthy. This delicate equilibrium reflected Caesar's understanding of politics. To rule Rome, he needed to satisfy both the masses and the elites, or at least prevent either from uniting against him. He also turned his attention to the grain supply, a matter that touched every citizen's daily life. For decades, Rome had depended on grain imported from distant provinces, and the distribution of this grain to the urban poor had been a perennial issue. Caesar streamlined the system, reducing corruption and ensuring more reliable provision. By cutting down on the number of citizens receiving free grain, while at the same time creating jobs in colonies abroad for those who were removed from the lists, he lightened the state's burden without provoking widespread anger. Perhaps his most famous reform was the calendar. The Roman calendar, based on lunar cycles, had drifted badly out of alignment with the seasons, creating confusion in agriculture, festivals, and administration. Caesar, drawing on the expertise of astronomers, introduced a solar calendar of 365 days with a leap year every fourth year. This Julian calendar, with slight modifications, would remain the foundation of Western timekeeping for centuries. To ordinary Romans, it meant that planting, harvesting, and civic duties could once again be organized with predictability. 2. History, it was one of Caesar's most enduring legacies. A mark of order imposed upon chaos. Beyond practical reforms, Caesar also sought to reshape Rome's political structure. He expanded the Senate, adding new members from across Italy and the provinces. By increasing its size, he diluted the influence of the old aristocracy and brought in men loyal to him. Critics accused him of devaluing the Senate's prestige, but Caesar saw it as a way to bind new allies to his regime and to reflect Rome's growing diversity. For centuries, the Senate had been dominated by a narrow group of families. Caesar's expansion signaled that Rome was no longer just a city, but the heart of a vast empire. He also reorganized local government, introduced new laws to curb extravagance, and launched ambitious building projects. Temples, forums, and public works rose across the city, not only beautifying Rome but providing employment for its citizens. Roads and colonies were established abroad, offering land to veterans who had fought in his wars. By settling soldiers in new territories, Caesar both rewarded loyalty and spread Roman culture farther across the Mediterranean world. His reforms touched the courts as well. Trials had long been plagued by corruption, with jurors swayed by bribes and influence. Caesar sought to impose stricter regulations, making justice less subject to manipulation. While corruption could never be eliminated entirely, his efforts signaled a desire to create a system that worked more effectively for the common citizen. Through all of this, Caesar cultivated an image not of a tyrant but of a benefactor. He was generous with clemency, pardoning many former enemies who had fought against him in the Civil War. Men who expected death or exile instead found themselves welcomed back into public life. This policy of forgiveness astonished contemporaries, many of whom had grown used to the ruthless purges of earlier struggles. Caesar's mercy, however, was not purely altruistic. By sparing his foes, he bound them to him in gratitude or in obligation, and he showed the people that he was above petty vengeance. It also made him appear magnanimous in contrast to the Senate's bitter factionalism, yet his concentration of power was undeniable. He was named dictator, first for a term of years and then for life, a title that carried both honor and foreboding. To many Romans, the word dictator conjured memories of leaders appointed in times of crisis, who then stepped down once the danger had passed. Caesar's acceptance of the role for life suggested something different, a permanent restructuring of authority. He held consulships, controlled the armies, guided legislation, and appointed officials. In effect, he had absorbed the functions of the republic into his own person. For the common people, this concentration of power was often welcomed. They saw in Caesar a leader who could cut through endless debate, deliver results, and provide stability after years of chaos. For the aristocracy, however, it was alarming. Many senators feared that Caesar's rule was the death of the republic's traditions, that the balance of power which had preserved liberty for centuries was collapsing. They watched uneasily as honors accumulated around him, as statues were erected, and as festivals were celebrated in his name. Some admired him, some accepted him, but others began to whisper of tyranny. Caesar himself seemed aware of these tensions. He was careful to present himself as a servant of Rome, not a king. He refused crowns when offered, knowing the Romans' deep aversion to monarchy. He spoke often of restoring order, of bringing peace, of rebuilding the greatness of the republic. But his actions, his control of offices, his dominance of the Senate, his lifelong dictatorship told a different story. Rome was becoming something new, something centered on one man's will. Despite the suspicions, Caesar continued to govern with energy. He planned campaigns beyond Rome, dreaming of new conquests in the east, perhaps against Parthia, to rival the achievements of Alexander the Great. He saw himself not as the end of Rome's story, but as the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the republic's inefficiencies would be replaced by the vision of a single leader. To his supporters, this promised greatness. To his opponents, it threatened the loss of freedom. In these years, Caesar lived at the height of his power. The forum bustled with activity, the streets filled with building projects bearing his mark. The Senate swelled with new faces chosen by his hand. Soldiers settled in colonies abroad wrote letters of gratitude, while farmers benefited from more predictable laws and calendars. To many Romans, life was improving. The uncertainty of war had given way to the stability of a strong hand. And yet, beneath the calm surface, discontent simmered among those who believed the Republic was slipping away. The irony was profound. Caesar had fought a civil war in the name of defending his dignitas, his honor, and of protecting himself against enemies who sought his ruin. In victory, he had rebuilt Rome, reformed its institutions, and extended clemency to former foes. Yet the very success of these actions made him vulnerable. By concentrating so much power, he provoked fear that he would never relinquish it, that he would continue to accumulate honors until nothing remained of the Republic but his name. For now, however, Caesar stood unchallenged. His vision of reform had reshaped the Republic, giving it new energy, new order, and new stability. He had turned the chaos of civil war into a platform for renewal. The man who had once been a fugitive in his youth, who had faced pirates with laughter, who had conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey, was now the supreme leader of Rome. His life's journey had brought him to a pinnacle few could have imagined, and the city that had once been ruled by collective debate was now ruled in practice by the will of one man. By the middle of 44 BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the very height of his power. The long years of civil war were behind him. His rivals scattered or dead, and Rome itself remained in his image. His reforms had touched nearly every corner of the Republic debts. Adjusted, colonies planted, the calendar aligned with the seasons, the Senate expanded and filled with his allies. He was dictator for life, consul repeatedly, the most celebrated general of his age. To the masses, he was a figure of admiration, the man who had brought stability after decades of turmoil. To his veterans, he was the general who had shared their hardships, rewarded their loyalty, and never abandoned them. To his friends, he was a leader of boundless energy, a man whose vision seemed endless. But to others, he had become something dangerous. The Republic, for centuries defined by the principle that no man should hold absolute authority, now revolved entirely around him. For many senators, this was intolerable dot at first. Caesar seemed to handle the burden of supremacy with his usual pragmatism. He offered clemency to enemies. He worked tirelessly on legislation, and he made careful gestures to show that he was not a monarch. He refused crowns when they were presented in public, aware that Romans loathed kingship. He spoke of himself as a servant of Rome, not its master. Yet the reality was clear to all. His will determined the course of the state. Magistrates served at his discretion. Armies obeyed his commands, and decisions that once would have been debated in the Senate were now shaped by his word. It was this contradiction between Caesar's insistence that the Republic still lived and the reality that he ruled like no one before him that sowed the seeds of conspiracy. Many senators had once accepted his clemency, relieved to be spared after the civil wars. But gratitude faded, replaced by suspicion. They watched as honors piled upon him, statues erected, his image placed on coins, his seat elevated in public gatherings. Each gesture, each symbol, reminded them that Caesar's power was no longer temporary. It was permanent, and it was growing. Caesar's own ambitions added fuel to this unease. He dreamed of further conquests, particularly in the east. Parthia, the empire that had humiliated Crassus at Carrhae, was a prize he coveted. A successful campaign there would not only avenge Rome's defeat, but give Caesar a legacy to rival Alexander the Great. Plans were drawn, supplies gathered, and legions prepared. For Rome's traditional elite, this was alarming. Caesar already commanded unmatched authority. If he returned from new victories in the East, his prestige would be unassailable. The Republic, they believed, would vanish entirely beneath his shadowed dot. At the same time, Caesar's style of rule sometimes clashed with the pride of senators. He could be impatient, dismissive of tradition, and quick to push through his will. Where earlier leaders had cloaked their dominance in the forms of republican procedure, Caesar often brushed aside such pretenses. This wounded the dignity of men who valued ceremony and the appearance of equality. For them, it was not only Caesar's power that troubled them, but the way he exercised it openly, confidently, and without apology. In whispered conversations, a conspiracy began to take shape. Men who had once fought against Caesar in the Civil War, and even some who had benefited from his mercy, now turned against him. They convinced themselves that they were not plotting murder for personal gain, but acting to save the Republic. They called themselves liberators, casting their plan not as treachery, but as patriotism. Among their leaders were men of prominence. Gaius Cassius Longinus, a shrewd and determined figure. Decimus Junius Brutus, once a trusted ally of Caesar. And most famously, Marcus Junius Brutus, known for his integrity and philosophical character. Brutus's involvement gave the conspiracy a moral sheen, for he was widely respected. His very name, linked to the ancient Brutus who had expelled Rome's kings centuries earlier, carried symbolic weight. The conspirators numbered more than 60, a web of senators united by fear of Caesar's supremacy. They met in secret, debating where and when to strike. They knew that open opposition was impossible. Caesar's soldiers adored him, the people celebrated him, and his power was vast. To challenge him directly would be to invite ruin. Only a sudden act, delivered in the heart of Rome itself, could succeed. Meanwhile, Caesar continued his preparations for the Eastern campaign. He planned to leave within months, leading legions against Parthia, and perhaps beyond. The conspirators realized that once he departed, their chance would be gone forever. If Caesar triumphed abroad, he would return with glory beyond measure. Their window was narrow, and they resolved to act before he left. The setting chosen was the Senate. Here, in the chamber that had once been the proud center of the Republic, they would strike. The symbolism was clear. Caesar would fall not on a battlefield, but in the place where laws were made, cut down by those who claimed to defend liberty. As the Ides of March approached, the 15th day of the month, Rome buzzed with rumor. Omens were whispered, dreams recounted, warnings passed. Some urged Caesar to be cautious, to delay his entrance into the Senate. Yet Caesar, as always, displayed confidence. He had faced pirates, rebellions, and civil war. He believed himself secure, untouchable, within the city he had remade. Perhaps he trusted too deeply in the clemency he had shown, assuming that those he had spared would never turn against him. Or perhaps he simply could not imagine that men would dare raise a hand against him in the heart of Rome. On the morning of the Ides, Caesar made his way to the Senate meeting. He was accompanied by only a few attendants. The legions that adored him were camped outside the city, For tradition forbade armed soldiers within Rome. The conspirators awaited him, daggers hidden beneath their robes. As he entered the chamber, greetings were exchanged, smiles offered, courtesies performed. It was a scene of normal politics, disguising the storm about to break. The attack, when it came, was sudden and brutal. A senator approached with a petition, distracting Caesar as others gathered around. Then, in a moment, the daggers were drawn. Blades flashed in the chamber, striking again and again. Caesar, taken by surprise, struggled at first to defend himself. But the assault was overwhelming. The senators, men he had pardoned, promoted, or trusted, now turned on him with relentless fury. Tradition holds that he received 23 wounds before collapsing. Whether he spoke words to Brutus, as legend claims, or whether silence marked his final moments, no one can say with certainty. What is clear is that Julius Caesar, the man who had defied Sulla, laughed at pirates, conquered Gaul, and reshaped Rome, fell beneath the blades of his own peers in the Senate House on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. For the conspirators, the deed was done. They had struck down the man they believed was becoming a tyrant. They rushed into the streets, proclaiming the restoration of liberty. Yet the reaction was not what they expected. The people, far from celebrating, were stunned and horrified. Many wept, for Caesar had been their champion, the one who had given them grain, land, and hope after years of war. Soldiers, though stationed outside the city, burned with anger at the murder of their beloved general. The conspirators, who imagined themselves hailed as saviors, instead found themselves shunned, their cause uncertain. The irony of Caesar's death was profound. The man who had shown mercy to enemies, who had sought to govern with reform and clemency, who had dreamed of new conquests abroad, was cut down not by foreign foes, but by those closest to him. The republic which the conspirators claimed to save would not be restored. Instead, their act unleashed new chaos, plunging Rome once again into civil war. Thus ended Caesar's life, but not his legacy. In the days after his death, crowds gathered, mourning him with genuine grief. Mark Antony, his ally, delivered a speech that inflamed the people against the conspirators, showing them the wounds and recounting Caesar's generosity. The Senate, shaken, realized too late that the assassination had not restored the republic, but destroyed what little stability remained. The liberators fled, their hopes dashed. In their place arose new figures. Antony, Octavian, Lepidus would fight to claim the mantle of Caesar, but that is the story yet to come. For now the image endures. Caesar, at the height of his power, struck down in the Senate. His ambition fulfilled, and yet undone, his life ended, but his name destined to live forever. The death of Julius Caesar was meant, in the minds of the conspirators, to be a cleansing act. They believed that by striking him down in the Senate, they would rid the republic of a would-be tyrant and restore the balance of liberty. To them, the daggers they carried were not weapons of murder, but tools of salvation. Yet the reality that followed was far different. Rome, instead of breathing a sigh of relief, sank into confusion, fear, and grief. The Ides of March had removed one man, but it had not solved the crisis of the Republic. Instead, it unleashed forces that would carry Rome into yet another cycle of unrest. In the moments immediately after the assassination, the Senate chamber was a scene of chaos. Caesar's body lay lifeless, his toga soaked with blood, while the conspirators tried to compose themselves. Some stood in shock at what they had done. Others raised their voices, proclaiming that Rome was free again. They emerged into the streets, their daggers still drawn, expecting citizens to hail them as heroes. But the reaction they met was not the outpouring of gratitude they imagined. Ordinary Romans who had lived under Caesar's reforms, who had seen him as a provider of stability, looked on with horror. Some fled in panic, fearing new waves of violence. Others murmured in anger, unable to understand why the man who had forgiven enemies, settled veterans, and distributed grain had been cut down. The conspirators attempted to frame their deed with noble words. They called themselves liberatores, claiming to have saved the Republic from tyranny. But the Republic they spoke of was, to many, an abstraction. What the people knew was that Caesar had given them tangible improvements: land, grain, jobs, and the promise of further reforms. They remembered his generosity, his spectacles, his clemency. For them, liberty was not the same as bread on the table or safety in the streets. The senators who now declared freedom offered no clear plan for what would follow Dot in the hours and days after the murder. Rome teetered on the edge. Crowds gathered in the forum, confused and anxious. Rumors spread wildly. Some said Caesar had been killed to prevent him from making himself king. Others whispered that foreign enemies would soon descend, now that Rome was leaderless. The city, that had so often been the stage of triumphs and festivals, was instead filled with uncertainty. The conspirators tried to steady their position by speaking to the Senate. They assured the body that their act had been necessary, that the Republic was safe. But senators themselves were divided. Some had been part of the plot, but many had not. For them, the assassination was terrifying, not liberating. If the greatest man in Rome could be cut down in its most sacred chamber, who was safe? Fear, not relief, gripped them. Into this uncertainty stepped Mark Antony, Caesar's ally and co-consul. Antony had not been part of the conspiracy. In fact, he had been deliberately delayed outside the Senate chamber when the attack occurred. In the immediate aftermath, Antony chose caution, retreating from the city until the danger was clearer. But as the dust settled, he returned, determined to shape the narrative. He negotiated with the conspirators at first, striking a fragile truce that allowed them to live without immediate reprisal. Yet Antony, ever shrewd, knew that the true battlefield was not in the Senate, but in the minds of the people. The pivotal moment came during Caesar's funeral. His body, laid out for the citizens to see, became the center of an extraordinary display of emotion. Antony, chosen to deliver the eulogy, understood the power of words. He spoke not as a detached statesman, but as a friend mourning a friend, a Romang mourning Rome's greatest son. He reminded the people of Caesar's victories, his generosity, his clemency. He pointed to the wounds on Caesar's body, inflicted by men he had spared. According to later accounts, Antony held up the torn and bloodied toga, showing where the daggers had pierced it. The sight moved the crowd to fury. The speech, carefully crafted, deeply emotional, transformed the atmosphere in Rome. The conspirators, who had expected gratitude, found themselves hated. The people rioted, seizing Caesar's body and burning it in the forum, an unprecedented act that turned the heart of the city into a funeral pyre. Flames rose into the night, smoke darkened the skies, and citizens threw themselves into the fire, and grief or rage. From mourning, the crowd turned to vengeance, attacking the homes of conspirators, forcing them to flee for their lives. In that moment, the liberators realized their mistake. They had removed Caesar, but they had not destroyed his influence. In death, he became even more powerful than in life. His image, his reforms, his generosity, these were remembered far more vividly than any accusations of tyranny. The conspirators had no program to offer, no leader to unite behind, no vision for what came next. The republic they claimed to save was already hollow, and the people, given the choice between an abstract liberty and the memory of Caesar's leadership, chose Caesar. Antony, capitalizing on the mood, positioned himself as the protector of Caesar's legacy. He took charge of the state, using both the memory of Caesar and the anger of the people to strengthen his hold. He promised to honor Caesar's will, which left generous gifts to the citizens of Rome, further endearing Caesar's name to the masses. The conspirators, once men of prestige, were reduced to fugitives, their cause already crumbling. But Caesar's death did not simply elevate Antony. It also opened the door for a new figure, Gaius Octavius, known to history as Octavian. Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir, Octavian was only 18 when the Ides of March occurred. At first, few paid him much attention, but when he arrived in Rome, claiming his inheritance and presenting himself as Caesar's rightful successor, he quickly became a focus of loyalty for many of Caesar's veterans and supporters. Octavian's calm determination and clever strategy would, in time, make him Antony's rival, and together they would shape the future of Rome in ways the conspirators could never have imagined. In the immediate aftermath, though the city was adrift, the Senate was paralyzed, the conspirators gone, Antony maneuvering for power, and Octavian beginning to gather support. Caesar's reforms continued, but without his guiding hand, uncertainty prevailed. The republic, far from being restored, was even weaker than before. Caesar had held it together through his will. Without him, it seemed destined to collapse entirely. Ordinary citizens, meanwhile, clung to the memory of Caesar. They told stories of his generosity, of his leadership in war, of the way he had walked among them in triumphs and festivals. His name was spoken with reverence, his absence felt as a wound. Far from being erased, he became a legend. The conspirators had hoped to extinguish his influence, but instead they had ensured it would endure. In this way, the aftermath of the Ides was marked not by the return of liberty, but by the deepening of crisis. Rome had lost the man who had brought it stability, and in his place arose factions, rivalries, and new wars. The republic that Brutus and Cassius claimed to save was slipping faster than ever toward its end, and behind it all loomed the figure of Caesar, dead, yet still the center of Rome's destiny. The Ides of March had removed the man, but it had not removed the force of his life. His death became the catalyst for transformation, ensuring that Rome would never return to its old ways. Instead, it would move inexorably toward a new order, one shaped by the memory of Julius Caesar and the struggles that followed his fall. The knife strokes of the Ides of March ended Julius Caesar's life, but they did not end his story. In many ways, they only began it. The conspirators who raised their blades believed that with his death, the republic would awaken from its nightmare of concentrated power and return to its old balance. Yet what followed was the opposite. The Republic, already fragile, could not survive without the man who had held it together through sheer force of will. His absence created a vacuum that no senator, no council, no single figure could fill. Into that vacuum rushed new conflicts, new ambitions, and new leaders, all of them invoking Caesar's name. In the months after his assassination, Caesar became something more than a man. His image, his memory, his name became political weapons, wielded by those who sought to claim his mantle. Antony used Caesar's reputation to rally the people, presenting himself as the guardian of his legacy. Octavian, the adopted heir, used it to legitimize his own rise, calling himself Caesar's son and reminding all who would listen that he was the chosen successor. Even Lepidus, another of Caesar's allies, positioned himself as a defender of Caesar's memory. The conspirators, meanwhile, had no such weapon. They had taken Caesar's life, but in doing so they had given his memory to his supporters, who turned it into a banner under which they marched. The Republic did not revive after Caesar's death. Instead, it collapsed further, plunging into new rounds of civil war. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed an alliance later called the Second Triumvirate to avenge Caesar and hunt down his killers. Together they defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi, a battle that crushed the hopes of restoring the old Republic. Yet even among the triumvirs, rivalry grew. Antony and Octavian would soon clash for supremacy, a struggle that ended with Octavian's victory at Actium and his transformation into Augustus, the first Roman emperor. In this way, Caesar's death marked not the restoration of the Republic, but its final transformation into something new, the Roman Empire. It is impossible to understand Augustus, or the centuries of emperors who followed, without understanding Caesar. He provided the model, the general who won devotion by sharing hardships, the politician who captured the loyalty of the masses through spectacle and generosity, the statesman who reformed institutions to suit his vision, and the leader who concentrated power until it resided almost entirely in himself. Augustus would refine and disguise these lessons, wrapping monarchy in the trappings of republican offices. But the blueprint was Caesar's. The Senate could never again be what it had been. The memory of one man's dominance lingered too strongly. Beyond politics, Caesar's legacy lived in practical ways. His Julian calendar regulated the rhythm of life for centuries, and in many respects it still does today. His colonies spread Roman culture across distant provinces, planting seeds that would grow into cities and regions tied permanently to Rome. His reforms of debt, grain distribution, and administration, though altered over time, showed how a single leader could cut through years of inefficiency. Even his commentaries on the Gallic War shaped not only how Romans understood their past, but how later generations understood the art of leadership and narrative. His writings, clear and direct, became models of Latin prose, studied long after the Republic fell. Yet, Caesar's true legacy was less tangible and more enduring. He changed the very idea of power in Rome. Before him, the Republic had prided itself on preventing any one man from rising above all others. After him, it became clear that one man could not only rise, but could dominate so completely that the old rules no longer applied. His life demonstrated both the strength and the fragility of the Roman system. It was strong enough to produce a figure like Caesar, yet fragile enough to collapse beneath him. Among ordinary Romans, his memory was one of admiration and loss. He had given them bread, land, and security in times of chaos. He had walked among them in triumphs, pardoned enemies, and offered visions of greatness. His death felt like a betrayal, not of him, but of the people themselves. They mourned him not as a distant ruler, but as a figure who had touched their lives. Festivals in his honor, statues in his likeness, and stories of his deeds kept him alive in their hearts. When Octavian adopted his name, becoming Caesar Augustus, it was not merely a political maneuver. It was recognition that the name itself carried unmatched power. From then on, Caesar was no longer just a man's name, but a title, passed from ruler to ruler, eventually becoming synonymous with emperor itself. Historians have debated Caesar's character for centuries. Was he a tyrant who destroyed the republic, or a visionary who sought to save it from its own corruption? Was he driven by selfish ambition or by a genuine desire to reform Rome? The truth, as always, lies in complexity. He was ambitious beyond measure, unwilling to accept limits, confident to the point of arrogance. Yet he was also pragmatic, merciful, and capable of reforms that improved the lives of countless citizens. He was ruthless in pursuit of power, but generous in its exercise. He defied easy categorization because he was above all human, brilliant, flawed, and unrelenting. For his contemporaries, Caesar was both inspiring and terrifying. To his soldiers, he was a commander who never asked of them what he would not endure himself. To the masses, he was a benefactor who understood their struggles. To the Senate, he was a destabilizing force who threatened their traditions. To his enemies, he was a rival whose shadow could not be escaped. To history, he became the man whose rise ended one world and began another. The Ides of March gave Caesar a kind of immortality. Had he died quietly after years of rule, his legacy might have faded with time. But his dramatic assassination, at the height of his power, seared his name into memory. The story of the man who conquered Gaul, defied the Senate, and fell beneath the blades of his peers became one of the great dramas of history retold for generations. His life became a cautionary tale, a subject of plays, poems, and histories. Each retelling emphasized different aspects: his ambition, his reforms, his mercy, his downfall, but all agreed that he was one of the pivotal figures of Rome. Rome itself bore his mark long after his death. The forum where he walked, the colonies. He founded the calendar he reformed, the soldiers who fought under him. These carried his legacy into daily life. Even when Augustus reshaped the state into the empire, he did so under Caesar's shadow. And when later emperors ruled, they bore his name as a title, acknowledging that he had redefined what it meant to govern Rome. For centuries after, rulers across the world invoked Caesar's name. In time, Caesar became Kaiser, in German, Tsar, in Russian, a title for emperors far removed from the streets of Rome. His life became a symbol of ultimate power, his name a synonym for authority itself. Few men in history have left such a mark that their name becomes a word spoken in languages they never knew. In the end, Caesar's greatest achievement was not merely the territory he conquered or the reforms he enacted, but the transformation he embodied. He was the hinge between the Republic and the Empire, the figure who closed one chapter and opened another. The senators who killed him believed they were preserving the republic, but in truth, they ensured its end. By removing Caesar, they removed the only man who might have held it together a little longer. What followed was empire, inevitable and enduring, built on the foundations Caesar had laid. As we look back, it is easy to see Caesar as larger than life, a figure of legend. Yet he was also a man of flesh and blood, who laughed, who dreamed, who feared, who made mistakes. He was a boy raised in a turbulent city, a young man who refused to bow to Sulla, a commander who stared down pirates, a general who conquered Gaul, a leader who forgave enemies, a statesman who reformed Rome, and finally, a victim of betrayal in the Senate. His life was a story of ambition and achievement, of risk and reward, of triumph and tragedy. It is this humanity, woven with greatness, that makes him enduring. Julius Caesar changed Rome forever. The republic that existed before him could never exist again. The empire that followed was shaped by his example. His name, his deeds, his reforms, these echo not only in history, but in the very structure of governance and leadership that came after. He was one man, yet he altered the course of a civilization. And so, as the centuries pass, his story continues to be told, not only as history, but as a reminder of the power of vision, the weight of ambition, and the fragility of human institutions before the will of a single determined leader. Julius Caesar's life ended on the Senate floor, but his legacy marched onward, carried in the hearts of soldiers, in the memory of citizens, and in the pages of history itself. Rome would never forget him, and neither would the world.